want to talk to you a little bit more about how we try to deal with sin and how Christ has already dealt with sin, and how do we come to the place of experiencing His finished work with regard to our struggles with sin. So today we're going to talk about the pattern of the flesh, why we get sucked in so easily to this struggle with the flesh. What does that process look like, and what does it look like for us to be free of that process? I'm really happy that you're here, and I'm excited to talk with you today and about some talks that we'll then have after this. So thank you for being here. Last time I think we talked, I mentioned that I was a big tennis player. No, well, not big. I made the point that I was never big at anything, but I was an avid tennis player when I was a kid, when I was in high school. And when I was a little older than when I was talking last time, like 5th, 6th grade, well, when I got to be a sophomore, junior, senior in high school, my dad's dad had an old Ford van. It was like a late 60s, early 70s Ford van, and we would take that around and hit a bunch of tennis tournaments. So during the regular season, I would play with the tennis team. I think I mentioned that last time. And then during the school year, but then over the summers, and before and after summer began as well, I'd start going to these tennis tournaments throughout the region that I lived in. I'd spend a chunk of my summer driving and sleeping in this old Ford van. Now, the van itself is blue and white-ish, blue and silver-ish. I lost a lot of paint, but it was a column shift. It was a manual transmission, but it was a column shifter transmission, and so it was a 3-speed and had this big old clutch. I'd put down the clutch and shift on the column and let out the clutch, and I'm a small guy anyway, certainly was a small guy then, so I'm putting in the clutch and shifting on the column and then letting out the clutch and driving as hard as I can, because the delay of that was about all that van could handle. The time that it took to put in the clutch and let out the clutch and put in the gas and shift it was quite a show, I think. So, and that was great. That van kind of got me through all kinds of stuff as a kid. It was amazing how well it ran, but there was one tournament that we went to, or one location that I played once or twice every year for several years, and I always thought that I could get there, and the van never made it, the route I tried to take. It was up in Ruidoso, New Mexico. There was a very nice, and to me at the time at least, I would have to go visit again to know, but to me at least, it was a really nice resort area up in Ruidoso, New Mexico called Inn of the Mountain Gods. It was part of an Indian reservation kind of a thing, and so everything was sort of southwestern Indian themed, and it was called Inn of the Mountain Gods. And it was up in Ruidoso, and to get there, there were two routes. There was the long, slow route that went around the mountain, and there was the direct route that went right up the hill. And I always thought I could get that old Ford van with the column shifter up the hill. Every time. Even though the last time I was there, 6 months earlier, 3 months earlier, a year earlier, I didn't make it. I started up the hill, and before you get to the top of the hill, the van would overheat and eventually shut down if I didn't shut it down myself. And I'd let it cool off and try to go a little further and immediately overheat or shut down again, and eventually I would have to turn that van around, go back down the hill, all the way to the fork in the road, and take the other route around the mountain and go back up, which, granted, seems like it's a longer route, but it sure is shorter if I chose it the first time. And every single time I would come to that fork in the road and go, well, I don't know what happened last time, but I'm better at driving this van than I used to be. Maybe it didn't have enough coolant in it, but now I know it does. Maybe the tires didn't have enough grip, but now, I know that they do. There would be something that I would think, this time is different. This time I'm pretty sure I can drive it well enough. It's got what it needs in terms of coolant. It's in good enough shape. It's got good enough tires. I can get this thing up the hill. Every time I thought that, because it shaves a bunch of time off my trip. I wanted it to be true, and I thought that I could make it work. And every time my thinking it and my trying and my working harder at it and my having better insight into how I might be successful failed me. Every single time the van overheated, had to stop, had to go back down, had to go around the long route to get where I was going. Every time I thought that I could, every time I overheated, every time I had to end up doing it a different way. It never worked. That's a lot like the flesh, my friends. We think that we can be our own source. We think that because we can do better, we have the right resources, we have what it takes, that we can get our own needs met. There's something in the job, and I can do the job well enough to get the money to cause security. I can be good enough at my job that people will eventually recognize me and I'll have affirmation and significance. I can make my relationships work and be affirmed and valued by other people. I can do a job well enough that it distinguishes me among my peers and I have significance. I can do whatever, right? I can cause the security in my finances, the affirmation in my relationships, the significance in my job. I can get peace from my circumstances if I can work them well enough. I can fix the circumstances, change the circumstances to bring about what I want from the circumstances and get my needs met. Listen, there's nothing wrong with having need. There's nothing wrong with knowing what that need is. There's something horribly wrong, and I just mean inaccurate, not morally wrong. That's a different issue, but I just mean totally in error to think that I can be the cause or fix and source of getting my own needs met. When Adam and Eve failed in the garden, it wasn't because they wanted to be ungodly, it's because they wanted to be the source of their own godliness. That if I know good and evil, I can do the good and avoid the evil, and that will make me like God. I'm all for godliness, I just think I could be the cause of it. I don't have to rely on God for godliness. I can be right without depending upon relationship. That's the lie that brings us into fleshly behavior. I can make things right. I can be right. I can bring about what is right. I can make the circumstances, the relationships, or myself good enough. And if I can't, then we get into coping mechanisms. I can't make it right, but it's not my fault, so I'm still right? The reason the relationship didn't work isn't because of me, it's because of them. And so since they're the one that's wrong, yeah, the relationship didn't work, but at least I'm still okay. I couldn't make it okay, but because it's not my fault, I'm still okay. When Adam and Eve failed at being good enough, because they knew good and evil and they couldn't be good enough and avoid evil on their own, what did they do? Well, they had really good, first they avoided it, and when it caught up with them, right, God found them because they were hiding, they couldn't avoid it any longer, then they blamed. In other words, I tried to justify myself, and when I failed to justify myself, someone else was to blame, or a circumstance was to blame, or I just tried to avoid the blame, so that I could still, even though I couldn't justify myself, it wasn't my fault, so really I'm still justified. That's the flesh. It brings about sin because we're trying to live as our own source. It's idolatry. So any predilection that you and I have to be our own source, to be our own cause, to be our own fix, that is a flesh pattern that always brings about sin. Interestingly, we recognize the coping mechanisms as sin. We often see someone who's trying really hard, but the pressure gets to be too much, and so they self-soothe with alcoholism, or they self-soothe by not going home and dealing with a crisis. They work all night long. They cope by overspending or justifying their own behavior by road rage. The rage that we experience at someone else isn't the initiating sin. It's the, I'm trying to get my needs met and this person is an obstacle to me, and so they're wrong and I'm right, and I'm going to prove it by overwhelming them with my anger. And so my rage is actually a coping mechanism for my inability to get where I need to be, to do what I need to do, and it's got to be their fault, and I have to be right, and I've got to make them wrong. So it's an overcompensation to actually self-justify my failure, to be justified in the failure of the flesh. That's what the road rage is all about. So here's the deal. You don't have to understand all of those flesh patterns and all of those coping mechanisms in order to not walk in them. The key is not to understand every flesh pattern. The key is not that you would be able to untangle every coping mechanism and every consequence of self-soothing behaviors. Instead, the key is to recognize that that is in fact what those are. That when you are operating in the flesh, when you're experiencing death, when you're self-soothing, when you're overcompensating, when you're self-justifying, when you're experiencing chaos instead of peace, when you're experiencing the death that comes from the flesh, recognize that it's because we're trying to be our own source and then we're coping for our own failure. Then you don't try to improve the flesh, you don't try to stop coping. Instead, we turn to the person of Christ. He didn't say fix your sin, he said fix your eyes on Jesus. He didn't say that you should be a better source as a Christian, that you should be able to get your needs met from the world and circumstances in your own effort and capability. Instead, he said put your confidence in Christ, not in your own competency for the Christian life. That when we abide in him, not abide in our own ability, then we experience the fruit that only he can produce in and through us. Listen, my friends, God is not wanting you to put your faith in him so that he can give you fulfillment in the world or fulfillment in your own ability, that he's going to make you as a Christian a better source for your own needs. Instead, what he's doing is giving us life, that we're complete in Christ, that he is within us, that he is enough for us, that he is the source for us, that Jesus Christ is the cause and the fix for what God has called us to, that only he produces the fruit. He produces it. So he is our joy and he is our wisdom and he is our competency in the Christian life, not making us competent for the Christian life. It's about him. So we shift from striving in our own effort and ability, and when we do that, we end up trying to justify and self-soothe for our failure. Or the better choice is to fix our eyes on Jesus. And when we see ourselves striving in the flesh or coping in our own self-soothing and justification, instead of trying to fix all of that, good flesh overcoming bad flesh, and I'm going to do better, and he doesn't want more self-determination. He wants more focus on him. He wants us to turn from the flesh, not fix the flesh, and fix our eyes on Christ. He wants us to live from the relational dynamic of his love and his sufficiency. So that we can experience all that he is in us and all that we have with him, that we would have hope in him and him alone, not in us and in our circumstances and relationships. He wants us to be living from the relationship we already have by grace, not striving because of the relationship or to gain something in the relationship, not striving from that relationship to get needs met from the world. He's not making you a better source by grace. He, by grace, is already your source. And the work to make that happen was finished at the cross. He's resurrected to bring us into a new life, not to make us better at the old life, so that we can walk in relationship with him in every circumstance. And he is our sufficiency. He is our significance. He is our hope. He is our competency. He is the strength amidst our weakness, not the one who makes us strong for every circumstance. He's not making us competent for every need. Instead, he is sufficient. He is good. He is gracious. He is all-powerful. He is all-knowing. He's the one with the plan. He's not trying to give us a plan to execute so that we can meet our needs from our job. He's trying to bring us through circumstances that teach us what it looks like to live from Christ himself within us as our source. Listen, in our next talk, I'm going to look more at the two cycles that we enter into. I thought I might do it in this talk, but we need to end. That's a great place to leave. We're going to focus on Christ instead of focusing on the flesh. The flesh doesn't define you. You're uncondemnable even when you sin because you're in Jesus Christ. So why would you sin if Christ is the overcomer of sin and death? So we're just going to fix our eyes on him when we feel the burdens of the flesh, when we succumb to the wooing of sin. That's all based on a lie. That's not who you are. That's not what you want. That's not what you really need. You're just going to turn from those things, not trying to overcome them, not trying to be better than that, not trying to justify justify why you went there. Instead, you're going to turn to Jesus and go, praise God, you're enough. I hope that you'll be here. My question for you is, where in your life is your hope in your competency, in your circumstances, in your relationships, and what might it look like for you, instead of trying to make that work, trying to make where you think you could get security secure enough, trying to make where you could produce peace peaceful enough, trying to make where you could be affirmed affirming enough. Instead of that, what would it look like to look to Jesus, receive all that you are and all that you have in your experience by grace, so that you can be free in the circumstance for whatever he wants to do in your life? Because maybe he doesn't have you in your job because it will meet your needs, because he can meet your needs however he wants. Maybe he has you in your job for what he wants to do in and through you there, that you would know him more and that he would make himself known through you. Maybe that's why he's called you to the marriage, not because it's going to be the way that you get your needs met all the time, but rather he's put you there having met all of your needs so that you can be Christ with shoes on in that circumstance, Christ with skin on to your spouse, to your kids, to the world through your marriage. Maybe it's not because that's how he will meet your needs, but maybe having met your needs, it's where he's going to display his godness in and through you, his sufficiency, his security, his significance through you, to the praise of the glory of his grace. Think about it, pray about, share your comments on this video. Have an awesome week walking and enjoying his ridiculous, unfathomable grace for you. Thanks.